So the field of wavelets is decades thick, so I can't do it justice in 25 minutes. So this is going to be a sort of little intro plus a sort of, I don't know, cubist impression of a few things that I find that might be of interest. And it's quite a number of slides. I have 25 minutes, so let's do a speed run through this. See how it goes. Right, so first of all, wavelets are these squiggly things, and you can draw them in 1D like that. The important property is that they're zero-sum and that they're localized. And you use them to analyze signals. So here I've got a 1D signal that has a bunch of structure, and then I can put those wavelets at different locations of the signal and dot product them and see what's there. So I do that, so I translate the wavelet, dot product it, but what I also do is I can dilate the wavelet and go to different scales and look at what's going on there. So that's essentially what you do when you do wavelet transforms. And, like basically here you've got the wavelet transform at scale S, and location U is the dot product of the function with the wavelet scale to scale S and shifted to location U. And if you look at that integral, you can see that it is a sort of convolution. It's actually a cross correlation, which is why I put this star thing there. It's going to be very annoying in the next few slides because it flips everything around, but we're going to keep it this way. If you look at basically the whole thing, so you take that signal and you look at all the scales and all the locations, you get this image here at the bottom. Let me see if I can do this thing here. Aha. So this thing is called a scaleogram, and it can help you basically analyze, especially like regularity aspects of the function. So you can see that there's a lot of activity going on there wherever the function does jumps. The other stuff that you see there, well, you've got, doing this right? Okay, so you've got the wavelet here at this location. This is our location. And here you've got the wavelet transform at a specific scale. Okay, so I'd like you to think about wavelets as sort of fancy derivatives at different scales. And as a matter of fact, what I just showed you in terms of wavelets were derivatives of Gaussians. And I'm showing you those because they help sort of elucidate the idea pretty well. So here you've got a wavelet that I define as an nth derivative of a Gaussian, which I'm going to call g of x. I can dilate that Gaussian, and then I can apply it to my function by convolving it. So f convolved with or cross correlated with psi s is f cross-correlated with this derivative of a Gaussian, but I can play around with this type of convolution architecture. So I can bring the derivative outside. So what are we looking at then? We're kind of looking at a smoothed version of the function, but I'm taking the derivative. Okay. I could also, if the function permitted it, I could also look at the derivative of the function and then smooth it. So this type of thing, I think, is a good intuition for what wavelets are generally doing. Just to bring back this again, so got the signal, got the wavelet at one scale, and then at a second scale, it'll just give you a smoother sort of impression of what's going on. I'm clipping here because the activity at these jumps is pretty strong. All right, so doing this across more scales, you can see that stuff gets generally smoother, which is to be expected by the formula that we just looked at. And now I'd like you to look at some things, some specific things. For example, here you see that the top of this box actually maps to 0. That's because our wavelet sums to 0, so it just doesn't see constants. Next thing that I'd like you to look at is this sort of linear slope, and you see that the wavelet's actually constantly active. And so it's I'm going to reiterate this quite a few times. It's taking a derivative. I added a quadratic here, so that quadratic kind of becomes a linear sort of object. And then we've got the third order, and let me go back here. We've got third order and fourth order that map to the lower respective order. So I can take a second derivative of a Gaussian, which is the little squiggle that you have up there. And then if you look at, well, if you look at the box, obviously it's going to map to 0. Second or derivative of a constant is 0. Second derivative of this this linear ramp is also 0, except for that little bump at the beginning. So you can use this as a sort of interesting indicator. Oh, something happened. Then the second order object got mapped to a constant. So obviously that only holds on the scales where the wavelet is basically smaller than that structure, and above that it'll look a bit different, which you see at the bottom. Okay. Oh yeah. So the third order thing gets mapped to a first order thing. So one interesting property that we that is typically mentioned when you talk about wavelets is the number of vanishing moments, and that's exactly what's going on here. So it's basically we're asking what order of polynomial gets set to 0, and in this second derivative wavelet, it's two orders, order 0 and order 1 polynomials would be set to 0. This is useful in sort of approximation, like function approximation and a bunch of theoretical analysis. So because we're doing convolutions, the Fourier view is an appropriate view here, and we're going to spend quite some time in Fourier space from now on. So since and the reason for this is that the wavelet transforms are convolutions, cross correlations, so they get diagonalized by the Fourier transform. And we write that like this: the Fourier transform of that cross correlation is just f hat times psi hat. Got the bar because the cross correlation is not a convolution. But those are details, and also you will find that there will always be a certain scale at which you will find my talk to be hand wavy. So I will gloss over the fact that we're cross correlating or convolving here from time to time. Just as a sort of like general idea on what happens in Fourier transform and signal space. So if you make one of those very small wavelets up here, then in the Fourier transform is going to be very wide. And if you dilate the wavelet to look at larger structure, you will see lower frequencies here in Fourier. What are other properties? Okay, that's one that I just mentioned. Generally, our idea is that we want to cover all of frequency space. I'll get to that a little bit later. And we will always find that due to vanishing moments, there will always be 0 in 0, but we can always find ways of recovering that information if we need to. What we've looked at so far are real wavelets. These are derivatives of Gaussians, and we can't really localize those very well in Fourier space if we did want to do that, if we wanted to be localized in signal space and Fourier space, because they're always going to have bumps on either side of 0. Doesn't matter that much because the signal is also symmetric there. So that's just as an aside, but it's also a sort of segue into complex wavelets, which are interesting to look at. So especially the Gaussian under certain measures, sort of second order moment measure, the Gaussian is kind of the most localized in signal and frequency at the same time. So if you want to use one of those, if you want to be localized in signal and frequency, it's good to use the Gaussian. There's other options, but this one, we're going to go with this one. So multiplying a Gaussian by a complex plane waves kind of preserves this property because it just shifts it in Fourier space. And this is called a Gabor wavelet. So I think I have some images. Yeah, so we've got this Gabor wavelet, which is real part is blue, imaginary part is orange. And we dilate it, and in Fourier space, we find, oh, it's a Gaussian. Here, we see some wraparound, but it's still a Gaussian in high frequencies. Okay. So one very important point to make is that these Gabor atoms are actually not really wavelets, which you see when you convolve that with this signal. You see that the real part here is actually, it sees the box. And the reason for that is that a cosine times a Gaussian actually doesn't integrate to 0. So we can fix that by subtracting a small constant that you can actually analytically compute, but it's always a bit annoying and it's a bit dependent on how you normalize your Fourier transform, I think. But you can also just compute it numerically, make that Gabor atom sum to 0. If you do that, you get a Morley wavelet. And then when you do that, you basically also immediately find that your not only is your box set to 0, but also your linear object here is set to 0 by the real part. The imaginary part does see the slope. Now we're going to try to generalize this to 2D, and I'm going to go with the wrong way of generalizing this. So why not present something that is, I mean, people do use these things, but in very restricted contexts. So you could do outer products, why not? But then you're not really capturing what you want, which is orientation in some sort of isotropic way. Looks a bit strange. You're also scaling on 2 axes, but you'd kind of like to scale on 1 axis. So scaling on 1 axis is possible, and this is going to be a little bit hard to explain, but it'll kind of make sense later if I manage to get to the end of this talk. Like, basically what you can do is you can keep high frequencies like this, and then kind of scale them at like as 1 into this smaller object and this smaller object, which are actually the lower frequencies. In Fourier space, like I'm kind of attempting to cover Fourier space with this thing. So what does that actually do to any sort of signal? Well, I'm going to choose one of those scikit images. That actually, my scikit image version has this old cameraman. They've got a new cameraman now because this is copyrighted, and they got rid of that one. So
it's better than some of the ones that they traditionally used to use.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. So like, I mean, I typically go with the coffee cup, but I guess which also has edges, but this one has enough edges, has some contrasts that are useful to look at. But yeah, I mean, they've gotten rid of all the other stuff as well. That didn't age well, let's say. If you look at Fourier space, you can actually see the edges of this cameraman here, and then we can see what the wavelets do, which, you know, they just kind of pick out these parts of Fourier space. So you're left with only that part, the filtered version, and then you end up being able to look in the real part and in the imaginary part at these sort of edge images at different scales. You can also take the absolute value, and then if you're a neuroscientist, you can say this might be a complex cell activation. It's also, yeah, I mean, it basically just gets rid of the phase, and you end up with something that varies a little bit more smoothly if you change stuff. It's also the sort of the base of the scattering transform, which I'm not going to get into in this talk. So we can also now start selecting more orientations in 2D space. Why not? So here we've got some oriented Morley wavelets that we've got the real part on the left and the imaginary part on the right, which you can easily generate with, for example, our Python package Kimatio, but like there's a bunch of others. Now we can analyze our image with that. So cameraman convolved with these wavelets, in real looks like this, in imaginary looks like this, and in absolute value looks like this. So you can see that it's picking out differently oriented edges of the cameraman at different scales. So again, fancy derivatives at different scales. So one property that is quite interesting in terms of not having to compute all those orientations is it's called steerability. So I'm going to explain this here in terms of the derivative of the Gaussian, because it's pretty straightforward to explain. If you've got a directional derivative of an isotropic Gaussian, well, that is actually a linear combination of x and y derivatives, for example. And so basically our directional derivative here, you can compute it as a linear combination of just two things, and you've got the rotated version of a base wavelet. So if you take that into the convolution, it just kind of linearly comes out, and you can see that basically it suffices to convolve your image with the x and the y version of this wavelet and get every other orientation with linear combinations of that. So that can be something useful in terms of computation. But since you're using an isotropic Gaussian, it also ends up getting a little bit less orientation selectivity, for example. So far I've basically talked about only wavelet transforms filtering in sort of like the densest way possible in space, in orientation, in scale. And one question is, can we sort of get away with not being not being completely dense? So can we, for example, skip some orientations? Can we skip some scales? Can we be discrete, basically, in scale and orientation, and potentially later even in space? So how do we measure whether we're doing well? One way of measuring whether we're doing well or not is to ask, can we invert what we did? So we're going to use invertibility as a proxy here, and this is basically getting into like one tidbit that I thought might be interesting and can like generalize outside of wavelets. So convolutions, how do you invert them? Well, if G is F convolved with psi, we go into Fourier space, it's G hat times, G hat is F hat times psi hat. We should be able to recover psi hat by just dividing, or F hat by just dividing G hat by psi hat, right? And it even looks like that's a sort of convolutional filter. Chi hat is going to be 1 over psi hat. Probably most of you see where this is going. Can I just convolve G with this chi and get F back? Well, if psi is this Morley wavelet on the right, and we go into Fourier space, we get this very localized Gaussian, and then divide by that, we find, like outside that Gaussian, we go to 10 to the 300. So that is not going to work. So we have to rethink this a little bit. And oh, by the way, yeah, this is called inverse filtering. I mean, I'm caricaturing it, but basically it'll probably not do a very good job unless your filter is sort of all over the place in Fourier. In general, also, like if you're filtering, if you incur any sort of noise, then dividing by these small numbers is going to like amplify your noise like crazy. So one way to sort of mitigate this is basically like imposing some form of regularization. So I'm going to do L2 regularization here on F, and let's just go through what we get there. Basically, we can go to Fourier space by isometry, can look at the integral, and we can basically find that we're actually only looking point by point at what's going on. We don't need the integrals, so I'm going to do an argument on the point. And if I compute that, I basically find that F hat is supposed to be G hat times a sort of squashed version, dampened version of this this psi hat filter. And let's take a look at, oh, by the way, this is a sort of Tikhonov ridge type regularization. If you do stats, it's the same thing. So if you look at what that does, well, it says, hey, your Gaussian is damping some of its high frequencies. Let's kind of pull them back up, but let's not do that where everything is 0 and we don't know what's going And then you do get a filter that looks like something. And you can potentially do a bit of inverse filtering with that object. Okay, how do you invert multi-channels? So we've got lots of oriented wavelets. It's completely overdetermined. So what do we do to invert this? Well, we do what you always do in linear algebra, except that we're looking at convolutions here, but I'm going to make the analogy that it's exactly the same thing as any other overdetermined linear problem. I think that might be helpful. If you do stats, typically what you see is this sort of linear regression problem where you're trying to find beta, and beta gets found by applying the pseudo inverse of x to y. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to we've got all these GIs that are F convolved with psi I, and we're going to try to find a minimizer F that just is the best in terms of L2. So we go to Fourier space, we go to the integral, we find that our finite sum, we can just put it inside the integral, and we once again can find that we're optimizing just at any given point psi. So if we do that, we end up with this sort of fraction of the psi I hats times the GI hats, and divided by a denominator that is actually a very interesting object that we're going to look at next. That denominator is actually our sort of X transpose X inverse, sort of the decorrelation matrix thing. If you visualize this object, you get patterns like this. This is basically all Fourier wavelets at all scales, all orientations. You add them up, and then you can check, are we covering Fourier space? Because if we do cover Fourier space very well, we get to invert in a nice way. So yeah.
When you say multi-channel, I thought you just meant angle, but actually you just mean all of the scales at different channels.
Yeah, exactly. So you're convolving with all these filters that can live at different scales and different angles, and every one of them will give you an image.
Yes.
So you're extremely overcomplete. So you need to solve one of those. You basically need to project onto the image of possible wavelet transforms. So if we can make this denominator object here, if we can make this be 1, then we can get away with inverting our wavelet transform in a pretty straightforward manner. If we can manage to make this denominator be 1, then we call our collection of wavelets a tight frame. And actually what happens here is that our pseudo inverse was actually just our transpose. That's the sort of linear algebra correspondence. So then our inversion is just a convolution of our sort of different outputs with the sort of flipped filters, and then you're done. So that's an interesting property to have. Typically, so this is weird that frames are not taught in linear algebra. So I've got a little explanation of them. A frame is sort of like a basis, except that you've got more vectors. And I'm trying to I've got 8 sort of frame basis vectors here, and I'm trying to sort of linearly combine them to or just analyze actually the red vector. And then, because they're oriented differently, you basically get all these weights on that vector, but they will help you immediately with the transpose to just reconstruct that vector. So it's a nice property to have. As a matter of fact, Arrow, who leads CCN, back in 26 years ago now, made a tight frame set of wavelets that basically in Fourier look like this. So if you then kind of square add all of that together, you just basically cover in a very constant manner all of frequency space. All right, so there's 2 minutes left. I'm going to do one more thing, because this this thing that we call Littlewood-Paley sum, we can apply it to all sorts of collections of filters. So I decided to do that with object recognition convnets. So we've got AlexNet here, which has filters at the very beginning that are sort of, they filter the image. They're small, they're 11 by 11 size. What do those do in Fourier space? So I can transform them to Fourier space. I kept the colors for fun. Going to remove the colors now. Going to square add that stuff up. And then I find an object that basically tells me what this thing is covering in frequency space. And we find this sort of lowish frequency ring plus some slightly higher frequency stuff. Now, this is interesting in the sense that you can compare different architectures. There's another architecture called VGGNet that has 3 by 3 filters. So look at this. I mean, you actually need to look very closely to see that 3 pixels by 3 pixels constitute a filter. It's very, very hard to tell. You can still go to Fourier space with those things, look at what they're doing. It looks a little bit more understandable. Remove the color, square add those things. And what's interesting and kind of clear that had to happen is that you're looking at higher frequencies because you've got smaller filters. Now the question is, was the object information at both scales, or could it be that VGGNet actually is able to extract lower frequencies if it wanted to? Now, I can't get into this because my time is up, but I'm very happy to talk to anybody about that later. The VGGNet will be able to do that through the different layers, even if they were linear. So now I'm going to skip to my last slide to recap this. Okay, I was a lot slower than my practices. So we've got, wavelets are translated and dilated to basically probe the signal. They're fancy derivatives. Tight frames are useful. This Littlewood-Paley sum of squared Fourier transformed wavelets governs invertibility. Some other stuff that I didn't tell you that I'm happy to talk about at another point. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Very nice, Michael. Are there any questions in the room? Yes.
I'm going to keep asking questions. I didn't understand what the application was here. Like, why are we looking at wavelets? Like, I assume that first sentence is about applications, but what can you say what that means?
Oh, so I mean, one thing that there's many applications for wavelets. One thing is sort of signal analysis, right? So imagine you've got a signal. One of the ones kind of that I drew at the beginning, a little bit choppy. If you Fourier transform it, all the discontinuity stuff will get lost basically everywhere. So you can't look at Fourier transforms of those things. You want to have a localized analysis, and especially if you've got these very, very strong singularities, you want to sort of zoom in on it, and the sort of dilating, contracting structure of wavelets lets you basically find these singularities. That's like if you look at signal. Other things that you can do, especially if you have these vanishing moments, is compress. That is actually something that Joachim talked about with wavelets 2 years ago. You can compress signal very, very strongly by using wavelets, by basically just throwing away the wavelet coefficients that are close to 0, and it'll keep a lot of structure if you reconstruct. That's one thing. We could go into scattering transforms for sort of data analysis. So it's kind of seeped into many different fields.
Yeah, I mean, you could even point out that the JPEG 2000 as a standard is wavelet-based instead of discrete cosine transform-based, like the original JPEG, because it's a little bit better at compression.
Yeah, this is actually a JPEG 2000 compression. This is orthogonal actually, so these wavelets actually create an orthogonal base. So you're not getting more coefficients out than you had pixels, and so then if you zero out things that are low, you can compress basically.
It's been also used in turbulence simulations to look at sharpening of vorticity in the cores of vortices, especially when you're using higher order dissipation.